Well, good afternoon. I think we're kind of itching to start because we're limited in the end by the coffee break. And who wants to skip the coffee break? No one. Okay, so I think we want to start rather than wait further. We've got two panelists still coming, but I think there's one panelist coming right here. Ambassador, just come join us up here if you like. Fantastic. Good. My name is Julian Dirkes. I teach at the University of British Columbia. I have a group of students with me on this panel, and then we have additional panelists. And so if we go through the row here, just to introduce everyone really quickly, I've got Christina Töppel next to me, then Trevor Kennedy, then Melanie Schweiger. We're still missing Pavin Chacha-Waipongu, I think. Then we've got Lakwa next, who's here from Mongolia. He's a producer with Mongol TV and has been involved in the Media Council and efforts to set up the Media Council. And then you've probably seen the Ambassador Mamba in several panels before. He is the Dutch human rights ambassador. We are here to talk about personal liability for journalists online. And you may have noticed along the way in some of the earlier sessions that repeatedly internet freedom has also been equated with press freedom, and these are two intimately linked topics. And so this is the specific version that we want to focus on. In the end, though, I'm an academic, and so I have the reputation of going on forever, and I'll claim that reputation despite the coffee break. I want to tell a quick story just to get us started. This is about the craziness of the public library gods. So has anyone read Amnesia by Peter Carey? Any Australians in the room? Well, so Peter Carey wrote a book about the true history of the Kelly Gang, quite well-received novel. And so this is his new book called Amnesia, and I picked it up before I went to the airport, so this is airplane literature. And we just lost our display, so I might as well keep on going talking. But it turns out the book is actually a cybercrime thriller. So Freedom Online Coalition, perfect. You should read it. But the interesting part is that it opens up with a scene where a slightly washed up Australian lefty journalist loses a defamation case in court and is ruined by it, because the entire print run of his book is destroyed because he lost this court case, and he's financially ruined. And then the story unfolds and goes into the cybercrime. It's actually quite good. But the reason that I mention that is that's what we want to focus on a little bit here today. That there are very different legal positions, even within the Freedom Online Coalition, on liability, personal liability of journalists, both in traditional media as well as online. And so to examine the impact of that. And to draw some links with that with democracy. So I'm going to just spend a little bit of time introducing that as a topic. This is just a rehearsal, really, of what we've heard a lot of today. So I'll skip right over it. But this is from the foundation, obviously, of Freedom Online Coalition and efforts. The link that I want to point to very quickly, just to remind you, right, that we think about the press as an important institution in democracies, and that's why we give it particular privileges. And also particular rights and obligations. And so the press as a locus, if you will, of freedom of expression is obviously a very important issue. And so thus we come to focus on it here today. One of the aspects is that media organizations, that is companies, historically in different ways in different countries, and including in different members of the Freedom Online Coalition, have shielded journalists in different ways, right? So that in countries where journalists are not personally liable, it is in fact a business that is liable, and so it shields individual journalists from that liability, and that has an impact, obviously, on what people write, and an important one. And so one of the questions then we're trying to ask here is, as we've heard time and again today, offline rights should be the same as online rights, and so what happens with freedom of the press, and what happens with this particular aspect of it, personal liability. We are the four of us here, me and the students, we are in a program called Asia Pacific Policy Studies, and so we're particularly keen on this conference for the Freedom Online Coalition because it's the first conference in Asia, and because this issue of personal liability of journalists has a particular role in Asia, including a different role to play in the Freedom Online Coalition members than it does in some of the other members, and so that's why we end up focusing on this. I'd also highlight right away that a couple times in earlier presentations also we've heard mention of Freedom House and some of the indexing work that Freedom House does, and it turns out that in that indexing work the question of whether journalists are personally liable or not plays a great role. And so, for example, the Mongolian score that Freedom House gives for freedom of the press is driven to some extent by the fact that journalists are personally liable in Mongolia. And so this turns out to be quite an important criteria for some of the indexing. Whether you, or whether we all agree with that as a criterion or not, it has, it obviously has a reality to it because most of us refer to that index frequently. And so what we've seen and what got the idea for this panel going is that in the past year, we've seen a little bit of a regional epidemic, if you will, centered on Southeast Asia, where legal or the restriction or the codification of personal liability has moved from from traditional media to the online space. And so Thailand passed legislation last year. Now Thailand obviously is not a free situation to begin with, but has now extended that liability to the online space, and then Thailand's neighbors all followed suit and more or less copied that legislation. And so there's a bit of an Asian phenomenon or an Asian cluster in Southeast Asia. So that's part of the motivation. Now, of course, all those countries are not FOC members, but then Mongolia is another interesting case as an FOC member, where we had the case last year of a blogger being imprisoned after criticizing a minister, and that gelled around the FreeBot, his name is Bot, so it gelled around the FreeBot campaign online later on, and maybe Luckwell will have something to say about that. But it was a case where, and I think the president this morning in his opening address, in fact, was referring to this case when he mentioned that there's been some legal struggles in Mongolia within the last year. And so I'll pass it on then to talk a little bit about what personal liability looks like across FOC members.
Great. Welcome also from my side. What we did is we looked at liability in press, on the one side offline, but also online, and then for citizen journalists as well. And we were looking around at legislations and also some published information to find out whether the editor is liable or the journalist is liable in a specific country. And for the countries that we looked at, we took the 26 FOC member countries, of course, and then some countries in Asia that were of a special interest to us. So India, China, Russia, and Thailand as well. And so our purpose for today is we're, of course, no legal experts. We're grad students, Asia-Pacific policy students. But what we're trying to do is set a more theoretical groundwork and an introduction for the empirical work that we're then seeing on later on by our other panelists. So we're going to more describe relationships, also draw references, and then show our findings of the connection of liability between those countries. So to start off with some numbers, we have, for the traditional media, 18 countries that right now, of those 30 countries, have personal liability, and only 12 countries that do not have personal liability, so where the editor then would be liable. In the online sphere, it looks a little bit different. We have 11 countries that have personal liability online, and 19 without the personal liability online. So in general, we see a relatively mixed regime, although even we actually selected our countries pretty well, so we have only the FOC member countries plus the other 4 countries. So it's still pretty mixed, even amongst the selected sample. And of course, there's also some partial liability, and there's some exceptions and some exclusions. And these special examples, or some of these special examples, will then be addressed by Melanie later on in the talk as well. One more thing, in general, we found, but this is very obvious, we found a high correlation of liability of editors and a high rating in freedom of press rankings in general. So we looked at the ranking of Freedom House for that was also mentioned already before, and we also looked at Journalists Without Borders. But of course, this is very natural because the liability included is already included in those ratings, and of course, they rate editors' liability higher than the personal liability. To start off, we looked at freedom of expression in the constitutions of those 30 countries, and especially this clause of freedom of either freedom of press, freedom of expression, or freedom of opinions or ideas. And here we could find that it was actually in every constitution, or at least amendment to the constitution, of all the 30 countries we looked at, was the clause of freedom of expression. But then, and this was the big difference between the countries, there was some that had a qualification in the clause, or that were qualifying the clause of freedom of expression a little bit by adding either limitations or just changing the meaning of it in general. So this was either done then directly after the first sentence of freedom of expression, or it would happen at some point later in the Constitution. So one example here would be the case of Russia, where we first of all, in Article 29 of their Constitution, from 1995, we first have the clause, everyone shall be guaranteed the freedom of ideas and speech. So this is the perfect clause, freedom of expression. But then on the other side, and as a second sentence, we also have propaganda or agitation instigating social, racial, national, or religious hatred and strife shall not be allowed. So here we have this sort of propaganda paragraph that is already qualifying the first one already a little bit, and that is adding limitations to it. So, and on the other side, propaganda itself is also not really clarified clearly. As a last thing to the constitutions, we also looked at the year of the paragraph as introduced. So was it part of the first constitution that was actually introduced by the country, or was it only amended later on or added to the constitution at a later point? But here we couldn't find any correlations to the liability and whether it was in the first constitution or it was in later on. And now Trevor will go deeper into the findings and talk about liability online and also in the traditional media.
Okay, so first looking at liability in the traditional media. So we found that two countries that actually, so based off the criminal codes and penal codes in those countries, we found that Germany and Ireland actually had personal liability in traditional media. And we had some examples for no liability. We say Austria, Finland, the Czech Republic, and so on. And we noticed that there was actually a cluster among Asian examples for personal liability from the countries that we selected. But I guess going into more, I'll skip ahead this one here. Going into liability online, looking through the criminal codes and penal codes, in many cases there really wasn't a distinction between traditional print and print online. And we saw that, sorry, it's kind of complicated with this here. Can everyone hear me? Is that fine? Okay. So very few legal systems do distinguish between these two different kinds of print. And one example, this is taken from the Latvian Criminal Code. And when you look at the explanation, so this is under the defamation laws in the country, we see the term mass media used. And this is used ambiguously to explain use of internet or other periodicals and so on. This is typically what we see. So in very few cases, we actually see a distinction between print online and then print offline. And that may just be because many of these laws were produced before internet was widespread. But I think one point that we have to bring up, so I mentioned the Germany case before, we don't actually know in terms of practice. This is just the text, and we were surprised actually when we found that in the case of Germany, that Germany did have personal liability. Once again, in practice, that may not be the case, but looking through, at least the laws as they're written, it is a little bit of a surprising, I guess, situation. So the one interesting area that we found with print media is the accessibility for newspapers to have comment sections. And in those comment sections, you often see a disclaimer where it says that the comments posted here, the liability, I guess, no liability for the newspaper itself or the intermediary, but of those individuals. And that, I guess, is quite obvious, but there might not be any legal structure to justify it.
May I have, because this is all in the penal code.
Yes, we looked at the penal code and the criminal code. But I mean, it's, obviously if we were to go much deeper into this would take, years and years of research to look at each legal system and look at the practice in those countries. I guess that the value from this, we'll talk about the conclusions later on, but looking at, just looking at each individual country and the types of wording that they use to discuss freedom of expression and going into the rights of the media and so on, and different kinds of media. So those are the kinds of things we looked at. We had a table that we produced, and from there we pulled examples.
Yeah, but it means that, say, it's not in the penal code in the Czech Republic, for example. It might be in the civil code.
Yes, it could be.
So
yes. Yeah. And Melanie?
I will try with this thing. So, no, that was the wrong direction.
The other way.
Okay, sorry for that. Okay. So, but we thought it's not enough anymore to just look at traditional and online journalists, but nowadays you also have to include citizen journalists, since there's a huge trend of blogging or publishing books on, for example, Apple iBooks or Google Play. So it's important to also look at the liability for these journalists, for the citizen journalists, as we call them. So the first I want to mention in this part is that mostly liability is in the hands of the publishing platform itself. So the platforms, they have their own policies. I will read out one of the WordPress. So the WordPress says, WordPress accepts no responsibilities towards content or usage of WordPress software and shall be held harmless from any and all litigation, liability, and responsibilities. So with these, it's just an example of WordPress, but the publishing platforms, most of them have such policies or clauses. So that would basically mean that the journalist, if he decides to publish on one of these platforms, is liable himself because he agrees to that policy. But to look at the more general, what we were doing here was at the more general geographic pattern, we saw that there's basically no relation to what we saw with traditional and online media, where still a lot of countries had no liability for journalists. So for citizen journalists, most of the countries say that they are liable. There are only very few exclusions, and that would be, for example, Canada. But for example, in the United States, even in the United States, the citizen journalist or the blogger is liable. So there are very, very few exclusions in that field. But then a very interesting case that I wrote here with Estonia is they are sort of a forerunner in that field. So they were asking the question, with blogging, you have the opportunity to be anonymous. So what are you doing with anonymity? So you cannot, someone who is anonymous cannot really be held liable to something he wrote. So they are actually now asking the question and trying to figure out how that could be included in their civil code. What do you do with a blogger who is, what are you doing with them? So that was a quite interesting case. And then we picked 3 special cases in terms of liability. The first one is India. It's not an FOC member, but still we wanted to point it out because it's an interesting example. So, and according to the Indian constitution, freedom of expression and freedom of press is guaranteed. But it was, as most of the people know, I guess, was highly qualified in practice. But now there was this major success of the Supreme Court that in March 2015, they dropped the law of against online hate speech and offensive content. So from now on in India, it is actually allowed to write on online media whatever you want. So that would basically mean that no journalist who publishes online can be held liable for what he writes. But then, is that actually going to be in practice? This is the big question, like the big question mark behind that new law. So how can they actually allow hate speech? And that's not going to happen. And the second case was Georgia. Georgia is interesting because they distinguish between state-sponsored media and private media. So journalists who write for the state media and they write something against the state, they can be held liable, so they can be prosecuted. But private journalists, according to the law, cannot. So for private journalists, it would be the editor. But then, on the other hand, they have the Article 25 in the Civil Code, and in that code, they write that the publisher, editor, or author, whoever wrote whatever was published, is liable. So it sort of is the opposite of what they say beforehand, that private journalists are not liable. And the third case we selected because it stands out since Ireland and mentions in their defamation law specifically the internet. So not a lot of countries added the internet to their law, like the word internet. So that's why we wanted to point that out as well. And but what the conclusion is of that whole research is going to be presented by Professor Dirkes.
Good. So we started on this examination with the idea that personal liability means that journalists actually have a financial worry about what they say, because if they say something that someone else can construe as libel or as defamation, it's their livelihood that's threatened. And so we started out from a point where we thought that this would be a really significant impact on the role of the press. But I think a little bit, certainly to my surprise, but perhaps to all of our surprise, we found a variety of different regimes govern personal liability. And so we have a number of countries amongst FOC members who we all think of as very highly advanced in terms of freedom of the press that still have personal liability in place. And so there isn't an obvious association, so it seems, between personal liability and financial liability of individual journalists and freedom of the press. I think we found some confirmation that there is a bit of an Asian pattern, and that's one of the reasons we wanted to bring this particular to this conference, and we're curious to hear what Lakva might have to say about the Mongolian context, and maybe if Pavin shows up, we'll hear a bit more about Thailand as well. And so that generally personal liability of journalists is more widespread across Asia, where we didn't see many patterns within the European members of the FOC. And then finally, I'd say where online corporate expressions or versions of the press are concerned, that we see some carryover from the traditional media space, so from the print or broadcast media space, but that in most countries at least, the role of a citizen journalist and what protections and freedom of the press would apply to a non-corporate, someone who calls him or herself a journalist but might not be attached to any corporate entity, remain relatively undefined in legal systems and certainly in constitutions. And then we'll pass it on to Lakva to talk a little bit about Mongolia.
Thank you, Julian, for pitching this parallel panel and have a discussion on journalists' liability in Asian context. In Mongolia, we just jumped over 30 places on the index of media freedom. And I find that very surprising. Maybe it has to do with we set up the self-regulation system in Mongolia, a brand new media council that was set up with the years' effort of some people in this room. But then when we look at the numbers of how many cases against criminal cases, defamation cases against journalists and bloggers, it jumped from 27 from 2005 to 2012 to 138 only in the year of 2013 and 14, according to the Free Expression Monitoring Report by Globe International Media NGO. And from that, the thing that gives Mongolian journalists and media houses and bloggers chills is that the last cases that you mentioned earlier, that the president, I don't know if he was referring to that case or not, the Free Butt campaign, the same criminal penalty was forced on few other people who commented and criticized the government. To name a few cases, there was 4 in the last 6 months in Mongolia. And that brings us to the question, does Mongolian judiciary system, does it recognize social media as media? And that brings us back to the terms of what is media according to the eyes of the judge. Then when we look at the definition of media in the Mongolian law, advertisement law, it says, it's very vague statement, says computer systems and networks. I don't know if it's referring to social media or not. People are being prosecuted, and that's very alarming. And the previous justice minister actually proposed proposed a law that will decriminalize the defamation and critics, but now the new justice minister is again proposing it, and he's bringing the bill into parliament, which is a step back in Mongolian media and online freedoms of opinion and expression. So Mongolia holds international obligation when we signed the Universal Human Rights Declaration in 1974. And it takes a legal precedent in the courts when it becomes published in 2005. And when it's published on State Information Magazine, that means it takes into full legal effect. But with a lot of recommendations from UN Human Rights Committee that says the state party should consider decriminalizing defamation and ensure measures are taken to protect journalists and threats and attacks. It's not happening, and the new law will actually make it even hard to for media to criticize or people to have their own opinions online. And the second, obviously not everything is one-sided. There are cases of, even in daily basis, Mongolian journalists actually defame people and businesses, and that's a fact. That's why the public sentiment is that there should be more responsibility in reporting with all, there's 500 media outlets working in Mongolia, so responsible reporting is the other side of the knife that the education system and reporters have, because reporters, I was just having a conversation that reporters don't know that they can get into trouble for the things they can say online on Twitter and social media. And with the growing number of social media users in Mongolia, almost 800,000 on Facebook and 100,000 on Twitter, with all the politicians being on Twitter, reporters we can't have our own opinions on Twitter anymore, because everything we tweet or say is, people think it's editorial opinion. So the international standard of writing RTs are not endorsement or views are my own only doesn't apply in Mongolia, because people are already prosecuted. So there should be a clear guideline between what is personal space and what is editorial space. And newsrooms have to, put that into their editorial guideline, and they have to promote it. And we have to have this discussion soon enough, or we will start being sent to prisons for the things we say on Twitter. And thirdly, the right to anonymity in Mongolia is not in place. It will be very hard for Mongolian journalists to take conduct in any investigative journalism activities. There's no platform you can leak information. You can't hide your face, because the Mongolian Media Regulatory Authority, CRC, has very clear guidelines of media organizations have to get registered. And on the comment section, we have a guideline of commenting that there's few words that we can't use. If you use it, it just turns into little stars. And that creates a lot of problem, because some of the words we're not swearing, it's actually connected with other words, but it comes out stars, and that's actually a step back in the online sphere, because who gets to censor what words, And this was only, this was no public debate was ever done. This was only a few specialists sitting at the regulatory official who are playing gods, and that's, I think it's a step back. So that brings me back to how did we become almost free in the eyes of the foreign, the two index makers. It's amazing for me, because it looks like the numbers and everything looks at the other direction. Maybe I'm a pessimist, but the third thing is that journalists are always liable. It's not the editorial, because in 1998 we passed the media freedom law that says that editorial will take responsibility, but that's not the case. It always ends up being the journalists, and And 70% of all the complaints and people who go to bring journalists to court are people in power. So editorials step back, and so it's the journalist who gets into trouble, and they get, so the last 3 cases I mentioned, the blogger Bat was sentenced 100 days in prison. He served by, we call it served by body, which means he was in prison for 100 days. And Twitter user Dawapil, he got 9 million Tugruks sentence, which is roughly around $5,000. And then a person who asked a question from the speaker of Mongolian parliament, he also got punished for the question. So a question is not even a statement, you know, it can't be libel if you're asking a question. So this is becoming a worrying trend, and I think that's so far from Mongolia's side. Obviously, the media NGOs, we come together, and setting up the media independent media council, it was a big step. We haven't had a single complaint yet, but I hope Mongolian politicians and people in power will go through the media council to see if they were really defamed, or was it really, you know, libelous, rather than using this criminal code as putting people away, shutting people down. And we have a very clear sense that the new criminal code that the parliament is going in, it's going to be a very big axe on Mongolian media. And if that goes through the parliament next year, I think we will jump back to 80 or 100 in the index where we belong.
Good, thank you very much, Lakwa. We now would have heard from Pavin Chachavalpongpung about the situation in Thailand, which is obviously very unfree, but unfortunately he's not here. And so we'll just imagine a very unfree situation. And instead we'll move right on to Ambassador Van Baal, who's going to speak a little bit in general terms as well.
Thank you. When it comes to libel, of course, I mean, the issue is not say so much as an online issue, but more in general. What you see though, and there were some countries where the first instance when they drafted legislation, say, for online behavior, then suddenly, say, the online it was more strict than offline, and of course that certainly, say, shouldn't be the case. I know, say, for example, in the in Europe as such, we of course most countries are member of the OSCE, and the High Representative of the media freedom of the OSCE, who is present, say, in this conference, Dunja Mijatovic. She's very much, say, was fighting to get, say, libel out of the penal code, yeah, and then say that most libel can be dealt with, say, via the civic code, which of course is I think is an improvement. What we see in, say, in my country, in a lot of countries, and you mentioned it also briefly, it is, well, one thing is what is mentioned in the law, the other thing is what's happening, say, on the ground. And I think we haven't changed law on libel, say, for quite some time, but I mean it is the jurisprudence that, of course, is leading in this case as such, and then I can't recall, say, a case from the penal code, but of course there are people who go, say, to civil court, say, to get there, say, who think they are well, hurt by what has been said by a journalist or by a newspaper. Having said that, traveling around, say, the world, I also see that even though in those countries where it's not, where libel is in the civil code, and perhaps also in the penal code, but you can also hamper journalism, say, by getting after them through, civil processes. you know, and especially I had the case in Guatemala, or cases in Guatemala, where you have, well, just bombing them journalists with processes, you know, and so it, the time is all consumed, the time and money is all consumed by these processes. So it doesn't mean that you're then off the hook as a journalist as such. But of course these cases can be, I think when it comes to those things as well, is, and you mentioned it, is the judiciary. And how independent is the judiciary, and what can you know, what can be done about that? It's judiciary, which is very important, and I think transparency is very important as well, because as I understand here in Mongolia, you have a lot of media. You don't have that many people, so I mean, how does it work? And as I understand, a lot of people in power or politicians, they own media or they have a big finger in the media, and of course they don't like to be confronted with you know, with news they don't like. And I think it's also, you know, it brings to the table what is at stake, or not what is at stake, but what is you know, wrong in the media landscape as such, and it is about transparency. And I think that is also, of course, a very important issue to bring to the table.
So,
Pavin, now that you're here, we've talked about personal liability. We've given an overview over FOC members, but maybe you could speak a little bit about the Thai situation, and yeah, right now, about the connection between personal liability as it extends to journalists and freedom of the press.
Well, I thought we started 2:15, so that's why I'm on time.
No, that was an hour ago.
Sorry.
You've got the wrong time zone. It's all right. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Anyway. Thank you so much for the invitation. The invitation almost came at the last minute, but I'm really very happy to be here. Very briefly then, in that case, I'm very much directly involved in this kind of, you know, problem in Thailand. I myself, right now, on the run from the Thai government, having been too critical of what have happened in Thailand for quite some time. We had a coup last year in May 2014. As an academic, I have been obviously critical of the monarchy and also the military, and since then they issue a warrant for my arrest, and then eventually revoke my passport, forcing me to apply for a refugee status with the Japanese government. So I had been unable to travel for almost a year. I just recently came out of my cave from Japan and just start doing what I'm supposed to do now. Yeah, I mean, I'm academic, but I also have written a lot of commentaries as well. So I really know this world of journalism too, you know, and what had happened in Thailand. Once again, since the coup, obviously, the attacks has no longer been on the street of Bangkok, but now moved into the cyberspace. And I think Thai journalists have been facing a lot of difficulties in dealing with the situation, in promoting freedom, especially now, you know, online media. There's a number of cases which I will not go into detail right now, but just for the introduction, one of the most famous case, perhaps as a result of our 2007 computer crime law. There is one, basically she's my good friend, Chiranut, who has been working for online media, alternative media, called Prasha Thai in Thailand. She's, I think, the first person, and maybe still the first person, who has to be, who had been charged with not moving fast enough to delete insulting comments online, even though she was not the one who posted the comment, but because her website opened up this, you know, feedback for anyone who can do it. And then, especially so much so sensitive is the issue of the Thai monarchy. I don't know whether you're familiar with this, but we have the less majesty law, which could carry the jail term for up to 20 years. Anyone who insult or cause how to say defamatory comment to the monarchy would be put on charge. And this lady who has been working with Prasha Thai alternative media obviously has been charged. That this is one of the case. There's a couple of cases of journalists. Another well-known Scottish journalist, his name is Andrew Marshall, who had been working for Reuters for some time on Thailand, wanted to write a lot of stuff which he found on WikiLeaks online. Obviously, once again, about the involvement of the Thai monarchy in politics, and also the intervention in politics of the Thai military. He was forced, sort of, by Reuters to resign. He could not have done it while he was with Reuters, because Reuters said that Reuters would not be protecting him. So eventually, he was forced to do it, to resign. Then some other cases of journalists turned writer who have been writing a lot on Thai politics and has been put on blacklist, has been banned. Someone picked his banned book to translate it and put online, and this person later was also jailed in Thailand too. Very briefly, since last year, there have been some developments in terms of more movement to curb media freedom of media online. The Thai junta released a number of announcements and orders, basically to monitor all the informations, and also to kind of like seek cooperation from all the internet players to comply with the request of the junta for not distributing certain information, for adopting self-censorship. And obviously we have a number of cases as well that these people, when they fail to comply with the requests, they have been dealt with jail term too. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it's particularly valuable to hear examples like that after an overview, and so I would be particularly keen to hear about examples of where personal liability impacts freedom of the press in cases you may be aware of, but invite general questions as well. Please, floor is open.
If people are thinking about their question, I would like to answer shortly on Ambassador Kiswanbar's question on media ownership in Mongolia. It's practically a majority of the media is owned by politicians, and the role they serve for their owners is to use as election mechanism, election propaganda tools. So they keep it alive. There's no way we did the math, Mongolian bloggers and economists that did the math. There's no way this many outlets can survive in this small market, but they keep it alive. And the blogger who was jailed tweeted this morning about the conference, and he tweeted that in Mongolia, officials who don't tweet speaks at the Freedom Online conference, and the prosecutor who didn't hear about what followers shows up in courtroom trying to prosecute. So this is exactly what happened on Free Butts case, because this was the first time we saw the court procedure on video. So it's basically him trying to explain what Twitter is, what followers are to the prosecution side. It's very hard to watch. And although between the official and the blogger, they have a personal vendetta in the background, because I reported on this case, I interviewed both sides, that it's only because the other one is using the criminal code and using his influence in the government position and putting down a blogger is not right.
Could you elaborate more on the free bat? Because you mentioned it, but what is it?
Oh, free bat. Oh, sorry. Yeah. That's yeah. I kind of figured everyone knows about that, but it was free bat. Bat is a Twitter user who is an aviation engineer who says he was wrongfully terminated from his job, and he started criticizing the Minister of Road and Transportation who was name was Gansuk. And so basically when Gansuk filed the complaint, he collected all the tweets that said he was defamatory, and he counted it up to 5,000. So 5,000 tweets about the minister, and the minister is trained lawyer who represents Mongolian government in a lot of arbitration and cases. So he his background is a law firm, so he used his expertise in the criminal code, and it was an easy win for him. And Bat was sent to prison, and he served for 100 days. And Mongolian media and social media users organized a campaign called Free Bat. Yeah.
Questions, comments? You will not be held personally liable.
Well, I just want to follow up on the case of Mongolia because as someone who follows Mongolian politics and economy, it's always very interesting to see how personal vendettas get translated into policy. And cases of major business projects that will move forward the economy by leaps is being staged between two political factions in the public sphere. And so they all use Twitter, Facebook, television, all means necessary to criticize each other. So in the case of Free Butt, it's just one guy criticizing basically a big minister. But when it comes to big political factions defaming each other, nothing is done. It's just public, nice soap opera to watch. So I have to use this, or can I just talk like that? Okay, I have a question for Mr. Calvin. I prefer not to say your last name.
It's okay. You will not be charged.
Thank you for the panelists for the lovely presentation. In the case of Thailand, I've spoken with Professor Im Sin-pung from UBC, and on the Thai monarchy and the Thai evolution of coup. It's interesting to see it's starting from the early 1900s and until today, still going with the military fighting for struggle. And in terms, you mentioned the monarchy, which I was wondering, how does the Thai journalist or even international journalists commenting on the monarchy and its relationship with the military would affect the liability of personal safety in the country, and with the governing body as a, I would say, dictatorship available of the military at the moment, what kind of trend do you see in the next 10 or 20 years on journalism in the country?
Yeah, it's a good and interesting question, and I have been dealing with this kind of questions for quite some time. To talk about the role of the monarchy in Thai politics and the alliance between the monarch and between the monarchy and the military, it could have taken 3 days to do it, but we can't stay for that long for this conference. But just enough to say that the relationship has been very strong throughout the Cold War, and I mean still today. If there would be an institution that Thai people consider to be the most important political institution, it has to be the monarchy. But then Thailand also has changed so much at the same time. In particular, in the past few decades, that Thai, social and economic developments has kind of opened up political space. So you cannot avoid seeing some sort of challenges to the old power, the domination of power of all those traditional elites. It has been so difficult, has always been very difficult, not just for journalists and also for academics who have to deal with this issue of monarchy and politics, right? I would say that there are two kinds of journalists here. One is those who are based in Thailand and those who are overseas, right? Obviously, those who are based in Thailand, you have to be so careful in what you have to report or talk about the monarchy, and basically almost of them have to practice definitely self-censorship. There is one particular case which is very well known in 2009. And also one thing that I have to also mention about the relationship between freedom of the internet, of online media, and the political situation in Thailand. And as we know, Thailand political situation has been unstable at least since 2005. And in 2009, once again with the problem with Thai politics, the lèse majesté law has been used as a weapon to undermine political opponents. It happened that the Foreign Correspondent Clubs of Thailand happened to host a talk by a controversial figure who happened to talk about the monarchy on that particular day. Even though it happened in 2007, the case came up in 2009, 2 years later. And that was because of the political situation in 2009. You know, they kind of like want to go back into the past in order to use it for political purpose in 2009. And eventually someone just reported to the police station that the FCCT, the Foreign Correspondent Club of Thailand, violated lèse majesté law for allowing this thing to happen. And once again, no one from the Foreign Correspondent Club had made any insulting comment on the monarchy. It just happened that they organized this event. The entire board of the Foreign Correspondent Club has been charged with lèse majesté, even though they did not, once again, did not say anything. Because of that, I think you know, many journalists working in Thailand, they have to once again very careful. And then the Thai state came down harshly on obviously with 2007 law, and then last year as well, and make the life of the journalists working in Thailand so difficult. For example, if you come across as being a little bit critical, then you would have a lot of problem in renewing your working visa. And I have been talking to them quite a lot, and then they have once again a lot of problem. For those who live outside Thailand, yes, they can say whatever they want to say, but obviously because they are not in Thailand, so they lack sort of first-hand information. So I mean, we kind of caught in the middle. Those who work in Thailand, they're supposed to know a lot, but they cannot write. Those who live outside Thailand can say much more, but yet cannot have access to the information. So this is case of Thailand.
Well, thank you very much. Despite academics' reputations, we're helping bring this conference back on time. And it's time for the coffee break, and we'll very much welcome further discussions about this, and come talk to us and so any of the panelists during the coffee break. We thank the panelists and enjoy the rest of the conference.